Sage is a herb that is a nutritional powerhouse that has a range of health benefits, but is widely used in cooking. Like most of the Mediterranean herbs, it's both very easy to propagate and grow, but also very tedious because it can get rather temperamental. So I'll give you a few hints and tips on how to basically look after it and how to propagate your plant so that you can have a never-ending supply of sage, no matter how temperamental it ends up getting with you. First and foremost to be aware of with sage is that it is a large bush, more akin to rosemary in how it grows than a lot of the other ones that you would be familiar with, like oregano and thyme, for example. However, they also have a very similar preference for soils, which means on the upside you can grow them in close proximity to each other because, well, they both prefer it a bit drier. The important thing to be aware of with the majority of your Mediterranean herbs is they prefer a warm, drier soil. They don't like soggy or wet feet in any way, but paradoxically they do like to have water. So you're generally best to err on the side of caution, going a little bit less than a little bit too much, because it will bounce back from being too dry quicker than it will bounce back from being too wet. Now, depending on the time of year and the age of your plant, you'll have your softer green parts, and then it'll eventually get your more woody portions, which get woodier as it goes into a dormant phase if you're in a cooler climate. You can actually grow from both with cuttings, but primarily you're going to be using the more younger areas because they tend to be more growth spurty. Now, there's a couple of standard tricks when you're doing pruning for cuttings. So essentially the main one that you want to do as a general rule of thumb is about 3 nodes. So I'll just count that as you want. 1, 2, 3. So you'd be wanting to cut just underneath there for cuttings, or a bit longer. They generally say 4 to 6 inches as well, so you can always err on the side of caution if you can do it for a bit longer, because it gives you a bit more to play with. So the 2 primary times that you're going to be doing large cutting is one for propagation and the other is for pruning, shaping and making your plant more bushy. The basic principle is essentially the same, but your focus is slightly different on where you cut. So they're not mutually exclusive. However, one has a slight leaning towards cutting in a certain position versus a slightly different position for the other. So as a basic rule of thumb, if we're cutting for the purposes of propagation, our leaning is towards cutting down to a point and cutting just below the node, because the nodes here are the primary areas where we're going to be looking at root growth. Okay? Now the difference, essentially, what you're getting when you're doing it for bushy and pruning it for shaping, is you want to be doing just above the node. So one of them is you're basically getting the extra bit for the root growth, and then the other is you're basically cutting away where you don't want it so that it'll basically grow out from the other branches. Here's a beautiful example of where you could do it for bushiness, cutting it right there. The idea there is that it'll then grow 2 new branches from these, and you go from that. Makes it a much bushier plant. You can control the size more. That in essence is the basic primary rule of thumb difference between the two. Neither is mutually exclusive, and if you were to basically cut it there, you can still use that part as it is for propagating. And ultimately, in the grand scheme, I probably wouldn't even bother cutting it shorter. Just make sure you give it the extra depth. Now, interestingly enough, keep it in mind, if you wind up with something that's a bit too small, so to speak, plant it anyway, unless you're going to use it for cooking, in which case do that. Because you'll be surprised at how regularly they will actually grow from that tiny little cutting. I have had success with many plants with much smaller cuttings, so hey, give it a go. If it doesn't work, what's the worst that's going to happen? You're going to chuck it away anyway. So after you've cut it, you want to strip away all of the leaves, except for around the top 2 or 3, preferably. You want to basically give it as much energy going into making roots as possible. After you've done that, basically, You can use some rooting hormone if you like. It's not necessary, but then whack them in some water or put them straight into soil. So it's at this point that's probably going to ruin most people who are giving it a go. It's a lot slower to take root and show that it's actually working than the majority of the plants that you will have been doing, like your smaller ones like thyme and basil and so forth, which generally after 2 weeks, you know it is either dead or it's working. Whereas with this, it's generally going to be at least 4 weeks before you actually see roots starting to show up in the water. And then to make it even worse is after you actually plant it, it's generally going to take another 3 or 4 weeks after that before it actually starts showing signs of new growth. This is variable. It may be quicker, it could be longer, but as a general rule of thumb, this is why you may wind up losing patience with it, or it starts to get a bit darker, get a little droopy, and you think, oh God, it's dead, and you give up. Don't give up just yet. Until it's gotten past the 4-week mark, it's not over. Okay? So don't make the same mistake I did for the first few times I tried and give up and go, oh God, it looks like it's starting to rot. No, it isn't. Not yet. So leave it in there. Make sure you keep changing that water regularly. Once again, one of my biggest problems is I tend to forget about that sort of thing. Now, if you're going for the more hardwood portion, which generally is either on a much older plant or at the dormant phase, it's a little bit different, but basically the same sort of principle. You want to get that hardwood portion, generally looking at about that 4 to 6 inches at least. But here's a little difference. You're basically going to be getting rid of pretty much all of the leaves and the green growing parts and sticking it into the soil. Into the soil's probably the better one for this because it's generally going to take a lot longer because it is dormant at this stage, and you're probably only going to really notice anything once it hits growth phase. It'll be slowly producing those roots until that point. So water's still fine, just make sure you keep it fresh. After that, you're going to wind up with your plant growing nice, clean, green softwood shoots coming off that, and that's when you know that it worked. So that's why, generally speaking, you're going to be wanting to prefer going with the newer growth parts in its growing phase because it happens more quickly and you're less likely to go, oh my God, what a waste of time. So I hope that one's been of some benefit to you and you found it useful. I'm going to go into more depth in regards to things like health benefits and so forth down the track, as well as some of the other herbs that I've covered, because it is amazing the amount of health benefits that they have and the things that you can do with them and what they're good for. Once you start going down that rabbit hole, it's amazing. Other than that, if you did like this, please like, subscribe and share with your friends.